We will talk about analyzing the shape of data when the data has been put into a graph or a chart. There are several different ways to analyze the shape of data. The first way is by looking at the spread of the data. This one is pretty clear whether it is more or less spread depending on the range of the set of data. Clearly, a set of data that covers more values is more spread, and one that is spread over fewer values is less spread. Some unusual features that you can see when a set of data is collected are gaps in a set of data, such as in this first graph. There's a large gap between the lower part and the upper part of the data. And another unusual feature that we are familiar with is an outlier. So where you have most of your data centered around some values and then another random piece of data that is either much greater or could be much smaller on the other side as an outlier. To analyze the center of the data, we are typically referring to either the mean, the median, or the mode. If you remember briefly in the video about box and whisker plots, I mentioned that the mean is best when there are no outliers, and the median is best if there are outliers, as long as there are no large gaps in the middle like we just saw in that first example. And finally, the mode is typically only used when one value has many repeated values over and over again. Basically, the set of data is repeating the same value over and over again. And finally, the shape of the data can be used to describe this and analyze the data. This first one is called a symmetric distribution. Symmetric, as you know, means it is the same on, if you kind of split the data in half down the middle, we have the same on the left as we have on the right. Now, it does not have to be exactly the same for it to be considered symmetric, just pretty close or almost identical. So a symmetric distribution would look like this. We also have what we call a skewed distribution, where you have the majority of your data on one side versus the other. Now this actually can be a little bit confusing because it's opposite, the names are opposite of what I think they look like. So this first graph is what we call skewed right, which means most of the data is on the left and there is a little bit of data on the right. So you're going to see the higher bars on the left if it's skewed right, and vice versa, if it's skewed left, you'll see the higher bars on the right. And then another thing that you might see in a set of data in a graph is our peaks. So you can have no peaks, you can have one peak, you can have two peaks, just depending on the set of data, but those are some other ways to analyze the shape of the data, is by referencing the peaks. Just as an example, this graph shows a symmetric distribution with one peak. The median, the middle is at 4, and it is fairly narrowly spread from 1 to 7. This graph would be skewed right since most of the data is on the left. And this graph would be an example of when we have a gap in the middle of our set of data. While this gap is not a large gap by any means, there is a slight gap in the data.